Hi everyone, welcome back. It's been a while since I did a horror review, so today I'm going to be looking at one of my favourite collections of short horror stories, The Books of Blood by Clive Barker. Part 1. Summary. Clive Barker's Books of Blood were initially published in a series of 6 volumes between 1984 and 1985. The stories have a broad range. There's monster stories like Rawhead Rex, in which an ancient monster is resurrected and lays waste to a small village. Jacqueline S., Her Last Will and Testament is a horrific body horror tale of a suicidal housewife who gains the ability to change people's bodies with her mind. Things lighten up in the dark comedy The Yattering and the Jack, a tale in which a lesser demon struggles to drive an implacable man insane. On the flip side, the psychological horror of Dread is one of the most chilling of the tales. And, in a story called In the Hills, the Cities, Barker shows off the epic scope of his imaginative powers in a tale about 2 cities whose populations combine together to create 2 colossal giants. Part 2. The Best of the Books. So there are 6 volumes of the Books of Blood in total, and each volume contains about 5 stories. There's no way I can cover all of those in a 10-minute video, so what I'm going to do is I'm going to focus on the best of the best and the worst of the worst, although mostly it's going to be good because this is a stunning collection. It's worth mentioning, for those of you that haven't read the Books of Blood, while they were published in 6 volumes initially, they're actually now available in omnibus form. You can get the first 3 volumes in one book and then the second 3 in another book. I would say that the first volume is probably the best, not because the stories are necessarily the best in there, although some of them are the best, but because it's the volume that has the most diversity in terms of different subgenres of horror. You begin the volume with a framing short story called The Book of Blood, and at the end of volume 6 there's a little postscript that takes us back to that original story. I really like that way of introducing the Books of Blood, as it adds a sense of unity to the thing overall, even if none of the individual stories actually connect with each other all that much. Following this, you have one of the most popular stories from the overall collection, which is The Midnight Meat Train, a story about a murderer who is haunting the London subways and killing people in a very brutal, butcherous fashion down there. I won't spoil exactly what's going on there, but there's a great analogy about politics and about the structure of society in that story that you'll definitely enjoy and pick up on if you read it. But then, after we do that, we then have a comic horror story, which is The Yattering and the Jack, the one that I mentioned in the summary. This is a hilarious story. It's not scary at all, it's just a silly bit of fun, and it's nice to see a shade of light mixed in with the horror, which is basically what the rest of the series focuses on. I like that because it's nice to have a contrast. It's nice for not everything to be completely terrifying and horrific all the time. So it's nice to have that bit of comedy, that bit of lightness in the middle of this volume. I also think the last short story in that first volume, In the Hills, the Cities, is one of the best of the entire collection. I really don't want to spoil the details because I think it's something that's more effective if you don't know that much about it going in. So I'll just say that it's so imaginative, it's terrifying on a very grand, sublime scale. It's definitely the most gothic of the bunch in that first collection. Outside of that first collection though, there are also some great horror stories as well. You've got Dread, which I mentioned in the summary. That's probably one of the most disturbing in a sort of realist sense. It's not a particularly supernatural story. It's more psychological, it's more of a thriller. And again, I don't want to spoil the key aspect of the story there, but yeah, it's definitely one to look out for, and it's probably one of the most haunting of the collection overall. I also really enjoy The Forbidden, which, if any of you are horror movie lovers out there, you may know that that is the short story that inspired the horror film Candyman, which is a fantastic adaptation of the story, does some really interesting things with it, so it's definitely worth picking up that. I think that's in the 5th volume, so there are also some good stories later on in the collection. When thinking about what stands out to me in the best of the books in this volume, there are probably 2 things. One is the imagination on display in a lot of these stories. Barker has a very twisted imagination, and that really comes across in some of these stories. As I said, Dread is pretty terrifying. Also, he has a very wry humour in some of his imagination. So if you read a story like Rawhead Rex, which is a monster story about a demon that's shaped, well, a huge monster that's shaped like a phallus, like, he has that horrific thing then combined with something that's quite funny, and he often manages to get that balance, do that balance really well. Oftentimes he's terrifying, but at the same time he can be quite funny, and when you have those two forces in a horror story, I think it makes for a very effective story. I also really appreciate his writing style. It's easy in horror to get subpar writing because authors can often rely on shock value and disgust. And When we get to the negatives, I will talk a little bit more about disgust with Barker, because there are some things that put me off in this collection. But generally he writes in a very intellectual, cerebral style that at the same time isn't too dry, like someone like Stephen King, who I can find a bit dry, to use a comparison. Barker has a bit of flamboyance in his writing style, he has fun and he has wit, but he also writes in a very complex way, which I think is important for something like horror to stand out, because, as I said, a lot of horror writing can just rely on, here's a disgusting thing happening, and that's what keeps you engrossed. Whereas with Barker, I feel like oftentimes the actual prose itself is of a high quality, and that's really good to see. Part 3. The worst of the Books of Blood. So, in a collection this big, there are obviously going to be a few duds here and there, and that's definitely the case here, although I would say that overall it's a great collection, pretty much from start to finish, although I do think, like I said, the first volume is probably the best individual volume, and probably do enjoy the first 3 volumes a bit more than the second 3. That could be a fatigue problem though, so if you were to buy the second volume first, maybe you would find that that volume is better. It's always hard to say with something like a long collection. Is it that the later things are worse, or is it that you've just read a lot already, so things aren't as fresh, things aren't as new, so they don't come across as interesting as they did when you first started. One thing that I find is quite common in the stories that I don't particularly like very much are the stories when Barker goes a little bit too far with trying to gross the reader out, or when he tries to get too much into politics and morality. A really good example of a kind of gross story, that not even gross in a good way, is in The Age of Desire. This is a story in which, after an experiment goes wrong, a man is imbued with like extreme crazy lust, and then goes around basically raping and murdering people until he eventually explodes in a fire because his lust has taken over him. It sounds maybe a bit funny in a kind of perverted sort of way to describe it like that, but actually in the terms of how it comes off in the prose, it's just kind of gross. I don't really like the way that rape is used in that short story. It's a bit awkward, so it's not particularly well done for me. I didn't enjoy that story at all. There are also a couple of volumes in the last volume that I didn't particularly like. These are How Spoilers Breed and Twilight at the Towers. How Spoilers Breed is framed as a kind of warning about interfering with native tribes, and while that could be an interesting thing to do in a horror setting, it's not done in a way that's particularly new or fresh. It's just very typical of that kind of story. You know, again, I don't want to spoil it, but it's very predictable in terms of the message. It's not doing anything particularly nuanced, and the villains are very one-dimensional. Twilight at the Towers is a generic-ish werewolf story. Again, there's just nothing new there or interesting. It's just a bit dull. Although I have been a bit negative there in the last volume, I would mention that it's worth picking up because the final story, The Last Illusion, is a fantastic story, and for those of you who haven't read any Clive Barker, one of his recurring characters appears in that story for the first time, and that's kind of cool because if you read some of his later novels, you'll see this character, so it's nice to see where he began, and also that's a very good story and a really good way to round off the collection. While we're on the topic of the worst of the Books of Blood, I'd like to pick up on something that I mentioned in the previous section about Barker's prose style, which is its vulgarity. Now, it's fine to be gross every now and then. It doesn't really bother me, it can be quite funny, but the amount of people in this series who defecate themselves when they're terrified, or wee themselves when they're terrified, is just too much. It always happens, and it just gets a bit kind of samey and kind of diminishing returns as the books progress. It's not a massive gripe, but I do think, there are many more interesting ways to convey fear, and Barker does show in some of his stories like Dread that he has the capacity to describe fear in all these different ways. So for him to rely constantly on things like, oh, and then they defecated themselves, it's just a bit cheap and a bit annoying, but it's not massively distracting from the reading experience as a whole. But definitely worth mentioning as something that I don't particularly like about the collection, and something that I wish wasn't there as much as it is. Part 4. Politics and Morality. A lot of Barker's horror stories are metaphors either for society, morality, or politics, and some of these pay off really well. As someone who often criticises writers for trying to put across a political message, I am willing to say that with Barker, sometimes at least, he does actually manage to put his politics, his moral beliefs in his fiction without coming across as particularly patronising, paternalistic, or overly moralising. A really good example of a great political story that's really funny is The Body Politic. This is a story in which people's right hand and left hand sever themselves, and they essentially begin a rebellion against humanity. It's a great political analogy, it's really funny, and also very dark. So there's an example of one that really works. Another big theme in his work is the idea that monsters, the terrible, ugly things, are actually the good guys, and human beings, the bad guys. Now that theme itself is something he does really well in a later book called Cabal, but in the Books of Blood it's a bit hit and miss. And the reason isn't so much with the theme itself. I think the theme's very good. It tells us a lot about kind of the way we look at different people who are different to us and outsiders, and that's good. But in terms of his human villains in these stories, oftentimes they're just really nasty, horrible people who don't have much to them outside of just being horrible and nasty. This is especially true whenever there's an authority figure in the book. A good example of this comes from The Age of Desire again, where one of the people who ends up being brutally raped is a homophobic police officer who doesn't really have anything to his personality except for being a brutal, homophobic, horrible person. And it's just not an interesting villain, and it's just not very satisfying overall if that's who you're going to pick for a villain every time. It's just some kind of stereotype of an authority figure. So that is one area where I think the moral side of Barker's work lets him down. It's not so much that there's a problem with having that kind of person as a villain, it's a good villain, but it's just the fact that there's nothing much to them, so when you're reading it, you feel as though the author is trying too hard to be like, this is a really bad person, hate this person, hate this person. On the flip side, I can sympathise a little bit with Barker. Thinking about this in terms of this is his first book, he was much more angry and feisty then, he was an outsider, so it's likely that he is going to have that kind of resistance to authority figures, and it certainly bleeds through in his work, not just in the Books of Blood, but also in future books. In a lot of his books, it's often the authority figures that tend to be the most corrupt and evil. However, I do think in his later work, he's able to get the balance between corrupt police officer or priest, say, and them being a one-dimensional or three-dimensional person. It's great to have complex, interesting monsters that have hearts, but it's also great to have a somewhat more complex or nuanced villain that isn't just a stereotype. Conclusion. If you're interested in modern horror fiction and you've had enough of Stephen King, I'd definitely give Clive Barker a go. I'd say he's more imaginative than Stephen King is, although I do like Stephen King, don't get me wrong, and I like the perversity and zaniness of Barker's style. The Books of Blood is also a really good place to begin because there's just so much breadth in terms of looking at different subgenres in the horror genre, and for the most part the prose is engaging, entertaining, and very smart. There are some dips in quality with a couple of the stories here and there, but overall, really good collection, some fantastic horror, and some fantastic dark fantasy as well if that's more your area. Alright guys, that's it for today's video. Please let me know in the comments below what you think of this video, what you think of the Books of Blood if you've read them, and what you think of Barker's other work. Also let me know if there's anything you'd like me to discuss or review in a future video on this channel. I'm always looking for new ideas, so I really appreciate them. If you enjoyed this video, please consider subscribing to my channel. I post new videos twice a week on Mondays and Thursdays at 4 PM. But that's everything for now, so take care guys, and I'll see you all in the next video.